Picture this. You're sitting around a campfire in the middle of the Mongolian steppes, and someone offers you a drink made from fermented mare's milk that's been churning in a leather bag for weeks. Welcome to dinner in the Mongol Empire, where culinary nightmares were just another Tuesday. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving deep into the absolutely revolting world of Mongol cuisine. From blood sausages made inside horse intestines to cheese so hard it could double as a weapon, we'll explore how the world's largest contiguous empire managed to conquer half the known world while surviving on what most of us would consider barely edible. The Mongols didn't just eat differently than us. They ate things that would make a modern food safety inspector faint. We're talking about warriors who drank horse blood straight from the vein, considered rotten meat a delicacy, and thought nothing of eating the same meal for months on end without any vegetables whatsoever. But here's the fascinating part. This wasn't just random barbarism. Every disgusting dish, every nauseating drink, every stomach-churning meal served a specific purpose in their nomadic lifestyle. Tonight, we'll uncover the twisted logic behind their culinary choices, from why they preferred their meat slightly spoiled to how they turned dairy products into portable nutrition that could last for months. So grab your strongest stomach and prepare for a journey through history's most unappetizing empire. We'll explore the science behind their preservation methods, the cultural significance of their most revolting recipes, and discover how these dietary habits actually gave them a massive military advantage over their enemies. Let's begin our descent into the culinary chaos of the Mongol Empire, where survival meant eating things that would make even the bravest modern adventurer lose their lunch. The Mongol Empire stretched across 13 million square miles at its peak, making it the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But here's what your history textbook didn't tell you about life in this vast empire. The food was absolutely revolting by modern standards. We're talking about a civilization that considered fermented mares milk a delicacy, and thought nothing of eating meat that had been aged under a horse's saddle for weeks. To understand why Mongol cuisine was so challenging, we need to grasp the fundamental reality of nomadic life on the steppes. The Mongols weren't farmers growing wheat and vegetables in neat little rows. They were pastoralists, constantly moving their herds of horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels across the endless grasslands of Central Asia. This lifestyle meant that fresh produce was virtually non-existent in their diet. The average Mongol warrior's daily meal consisted primarily of dairy products and meat, with very little else. Their breakfast might include arak, which is fermented mare's milk with an alcohol content similar to beer. This wasn't just a morning beverage. It was a staple food that provided calories, nutrients, and hydration all in one. The fermentation process gave it a sour, tangy flavor that many visitors described as nauseating. But arak just the beginning of the Mongol dairy experience. They also consumed large quantities of dried curds, which were essentially chunks of sour milk that had been left to harden in the sun. These curds were so tough that they had to be softened in water or broth before eating. Imagine trying to chew on what essentially amounted to cheese-flavored rocks, and you'll begin to understand the texture challenges of Mongol cuisine. The meat portion of their diet was equally challenging for outsiders. Mongols practiced a form of food preservation that involved placing strips of raw meat under their horse's saddle. As they rode across the steppes, the constant pressure and movement would compress the meat, while the salt from the horse's sweat would cure it. After several days of this process, they would have what they considered perfectly edible dried meat. This saddle-cured meat had a texture somewhere between jerky and leather, with a distinctly salty, gamey flavor that was intensified by its unusual preparation method. European travelers who encountered this delicacy often described it as nearly inedible, requiring extensive chewing and strong stomachs to consume. When the Mongols did cook their meat, the methods were often equally off-putting to foreign visitors. One common technique involved stuffing a sheep or goat carcass with hot stones that had been heated in a fire. The animal would be sewn shut and left to cook from the inside out, creating a steaming, pressure-cooked meal that retained all of its juices and flavors in ways that many found overwhelming. The Mongols also had a particular fondness for blood-based dishes. Fresh blood from slaughtered animals was often mixed with milk to create a protein-rich drink, or it was allowed to coagulate and then fried into what could generously be called blood pancakes. These dishes were nutritionally dense and practical for nomadic life, but they presented significant psychological barriers for anyone not raised in the culture. Vegetables were so rare in the traditional Mongol diet that when they did appear, they were often in forms that seemed strange to agricultural societies. Wild onions, garlic, and various herbs were gathered when available, but these were seasonal treats rather than dietary staples. The lack of consistent plant matter in their diet meant that Mongols often suffered from what we would now recognize as scurvy and other vitamin deficiencies. The drinking habits of the Mongols were equally challenging for outsiders. Besides the ubiquitous fermented mare's milk, they also consumed kumis, which was fermented milk from various animals, including camels and yaks. Each type of fermented milk had its own distinct flavor profile, ranging from mildly sour to intensely pungent, depending on the animal source and fermentation time. Water was actually less commonly consumed than these fermented dairy products, partly because clean water sources were not always available on the steppes, and partly because the fermented drinks provided more nutritional value. The alcohol content in these beverages also helped preserve them during long journeys, making them more practical than fresh water for nomadic life. The Mongol approach to food storage was dictated by their mobile lifestyle. everything had to be portable, durable, and able to withstand extreme temperature variations. This meant that most of their food was either dried, fermented, or preserved in ways that concentrated flavors to sometimes overwhelming intensities. Fresh food was a luxury that simply wasn't practical for people who might need to pack up their entire lives and move at a moment's notice. Seasonal variations in the Mongol diet were extreme. During summer months, when the herds were producing plenty of milk, dairy products dominated their meals. Winter brought a shift toward preserved meats, and whatever dried foods they had managed to store during the warmer months. This cyclical eating pattern meant that Mongols were constantly adapting their diet based on what their animals could provide and what the harsh steppe environment would allow. The social aspects of Mongol dining were equally foreign to settled agricultural societies. Meals were often communal affairs where everyone ate from the same pot or bowl, using their hands or simple knives to tear off pieces of meat. The concept of individual portions or personal eating utensils was largely absent from traditional Mongol culture. Hospitality customs around food were strictly observed, but could be challenging for guests. Refusing offered food was considered deeply insulting, even if that food was fermented mare's milk that had been aging in a leather bag for weeks. Visitors to Mongol camps often found themselves in the awkward position of having to consume foods that their stomachs were completely unprepared for, all while maintaining polite expressions of gratitude. The Mongol relationship with food was fundamentally different from agricultural societies because it was based on scarcity and practicality rather than abundance and pleasure. Every meal was an exercise in survival, and food preferences were secondary to nutritional necessity. This created a cuisine that was perfectly adapted to nomadic life, but seemed almost alien to anyone from a farming culture. As we drift deeper into this exploration of Mongol culinary practices, we begin to see how their entire food system was a reflection of their harsh environment and mobile lifestyle, creating eating habits that would challenge even the most adventurous modern food enthusiasts. To understand why Mongol food was so revolting to outsiders, we need to step into the boots of a nomadic herder on the steppes. Picture this. You're living in a world where the nearest grocery store is about 800 years in the future, and your entire existence depends on animals that need to keep moving to find fresh grass. The Mongols didn't choose their diet because they enjoyed drinking fermented mare's milk or eating raw horse liver. They ate what they ate because the alternative was death. The steppes of Mongolia are harsh, unforgiving, and completely unsuitable for farming. The growing season is maybe 4 months if you're lucky, and the soil is about as fertile as concrete. So the Mongols became masters of mobility. Their entire culture revolved around following their herds across vast distances, chasing seasonal pastures. This nomadic lifestyle shaped every aspect of their cuisine, creating a food culture that prioritized survival over flavor, portability over presentation, and nutrition over, well, not making people gag. The foundation of the Mongol diet was what they called the five snouts: horses, cattle, sheep, goats, and camels. Each animal served multiple purposes beyond just food. Horses provided transportation and warfare capabilities. Cattle gave milk and could carry heavy loads. Sheep offered wool and meat. Goats were hardy survivors that could eat almost anything. Camels were the ultimate desert vehicles, capable of carrying enormous loads across impossible terrain. But here's where it gets interesting from a food perspective. The Mongols didn't just eat these animals, they consumed every single part of them. And I mean everything. The blood, the organs, the bones, even the contents of the stomach. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant death on the steppes. Let's start with dairy, which formed the backbone of Mongol nutrition. Mare's milk was considered the ultimate luxury. Fresh mare's milk was drunk immediately after milking, but most of it was processed into arag, that fermented alcoholic beverage we mentioned earlier. The fermentation process was crucial because it preserved the milk and created a drink that could provide both nutrition and a mild buzz during long, cold nights. The process of making arag was fascinating and disgusting in equal measure. Fresh mare's milk was poured into a leather bag made from a horse's stomach. Yes, you heard that right, a stomach bag. This bag was then hung from the roof of a jur, the traditional Mongol dwelling, and family members would take turns stirring it with a wooden paddle throughout the day. The constant agitation, combined with naturally occurring bacteria in the stomach lining, would ferment the milk over several days. The result was a slightly alcoholic, sour, and effervescent drink that tasted like a combination of buttermilk and weak beer. Visitors described it as having the consistency of thin yogurt with a sharp, tangy flavor that could make your eyes water. But mare's milk wasn't the only dairy product. Cow's milk, sheep's milk, and goat's milk were all processed into various forms of cheese and dried curds. The Mongols created a hard cheese called arul by cutting fresh cheese into small pieces and leaving them to dry in the sun and wind. These dried cheese pieces became rock hard and could last for months without spoiling. Arul was perfect for nomadic life because it was lightweight, nutritious, and virtually indestructible. Warriors would carry these cheese rocks in their saddlebags, and when they needed sustenance, they would either gnaw on them directly or dissolve them in hot water to create a kind of cheese soup. The taste was intensely salty and sour, with a texture that required serious jaw strength to consume. The Mongols also created a dried milk product called Arul's cousin, dried milk curds that were processed into a powder. This milk powder could be mixed with water to create an instant dairy drink, or it could be added to soups and stews for extra nutrition. The powder had a concentrated, almost overwhelming dairy flavor that visitors often found nauseating. Moving beyond dairy, let's talk about meat preservation. The Mongols developed several methods for preserving meat that would keep it edible for months without refrigeration. The most famous of these was bortz, which was essentially Mongol jerky taken to an extreme level. Bortz was made by cutting meat into thin strips and hanging them from the roof of a jur to dry in the constant wind of the steppes. The dry climate and constant air circulation would dehydrate the meat completely, creating strips that were harder than leather and about as appetizing as shoe soles. But bortz was incredibly nutritious and could last for up to 2 years without spoiling. To eat bortz, Mongols would either gnaw on it directly, which required teeth like a beaver, or they would pound it into powder and mix it with hot water to create a meat soup. The rehydrated bortz had a concentrated, gamey flavor that was incredibly intense. Imagine the strongest beef jerky you've ever tasted, then multiply that by about 10. Another preservation method was creating a kind of meat paste by mixing ground dried meat with fat and salt. This paste could be stored in animal bladders or stomach pouches and would remain edible for months. The fat prevented the meat from going rancid, while the salt acted as a preservative. The result was a dense, greasy, intensely flavored paste that provided enormous amounts of calories and protein. The Mongols also practiced a form of meat preservation that would make modern food safety inspectors faint. They would bury meat in the ground, often in permafrost areas, and let it age for months or even years. This buried meat would develop a strong, fermented flavor that was considered a delicacy among the Mongols, but smelled like rotting flesh to outsiders. Blood played a crucial role in Mongol cuisine, not just as an ingredient, but as a survival tool. Fresh blood from horses, cattle, and sheep was consumed immediately after slaughter because it's incredibly rich in iron and other nutrients. But the Mongols also developed ways to preserve blood for later consumption. They would mix fresh blood with milk and salt, then stuff this mixture into cleaned intestines to create blood sausages. These sausages could be dried and stored for months, providing a concentrated source of protein and iron. The taste was metallic and intense, with a texture that was simultaneously creamy and grainy. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols developed a complete philosophy around food that prioritized function over form. Every meal was designed to provide maximum nutrition with minimum preparation time. They couldn't afford to spend hours cooking elaborate dishes because they needed to be ready to move at a moment's notice. This utilitarian approach to food created a cuisine that was perfectly adapted to nomadic life, but absolutely horrifying to settled peoples who had the luxury of caring about taste and presentation. The Mongols ate to survive, not to enjoy, and their food reflected this harsh reality. the Mongols had developed an intricate relationship with dairy products that would seem utterly alien to modern sensibilities. Their nomadic lifestyle demanded preservation methods that could withstand the harsh realities of constant movement across vast steppes, extreme temperature fluctuations, and the absence of any refrigeration technology. Mare's milk formed the foundation of Mongol dairy culture, and the process of obtaining it was both labor-intensive and precarious. Mongol women would approach the mares multiple times throughout the day, often facing kicks and bites from animals that were naturally protective of their foals. The milking process required incredible skill and timing, as mares produced significantly less milk than cattle, and only during specific periods. The fresh mare's milk itself possessed a distinctly different character from cow's milk. It contained higher levels of lactose and had a slightly sweet, almost medicinal taste that many foreign visitors found deeply unsettling. The milk was thinner in consistency, with a bluish-white color that seemed almost unnatural to those accustomed to the rich, creamy appearance of bovine milk. But fresh consumption was rarely the goal. The Mongols had mastered the art of fermentation, transforming this precious liquid into arak, also known as kumis. This fermented mare's milk became the cornerstone of Mongol nutrition and social culture. The fermentation process began immediately after milking, using leather bags called kuga that hung from the walls of the jur. The preparation of arak required constant attention and physical labor. Family members would take turns churning the milk by beating the leather bags with wooden paddles, sometimes for hours at a time. The rhythmic thumping sound became a constant background noise in Mongol encampments, a percussion that marked the passage of time and the progress of fermentation. The fermentation process itself was a delicate balance of bacterial cultures, wild yeasts, and environmental factors. The leather bags, never fully cleaned between uses, harbored colonies of microorganisms that would transform the milk's sugars into alcohol and lactic acid. The temperature fluctuations of the steppe, from scorching days to freezing nights, created unique fermentation conditions that produced arak's distinctive character. After several days of fermentation, the arak developed a complex flavor profile that defied easy description. It possessed a tangy, sour taste with alcoholic undertones, typically reaching an alcohol content of 2 to 3%. The texture became slightly effervescent, with a thin, almost watery consistency that bore little resemblance to its original form. Foreign visitors consistently described arak with barely concealed disgust. Giovanni de Payan del Carpine, a Franciscan friar who visited the Mongol court in the 13th century, wrote that the drink had a very bitter taste and caused immediate digestive distress in those unaccustomed to it. The smell alone was often enough to turn away European visitors, who compared it to sour milk mixed with alcohol and leather. Beyond arak, Mongols created an entire spectrum of fermented dairy products, each with its own preparation method and cultural significance. Arul, or dried curds, represented one of the most practical preservation techniques. These rock-hard chunks of concentrated dairy could last for months without spoiling, providing essential nutrition during long journeys or harsh winters. The process of making arul began with allowing fresh milk to sour naturally in the open air. The curds would separate from the whey, creating a chunky, cottage cheese-like substance with an intensely sour flavor. These curds were then pressed into flat cakes and left to dry in the sun and wind for several days, gradually hardening into pieces that could chip teeth if bitten incorrectly. The finished arul possessed an almost leather-like texture and a concentrated, overwhelmingly sour taste that could make uninitiated mouths pucker involuntarily. Mongols would suck on these dried curds like candy, gradually softening them with saliva until they became edible. The process required patience and technique, as attempting to bite down on fully dried arul could result in broken teeth. Izjai, another fermented dairy product, represented the Mongols' ability to extract maximum nutrition from minimal resources. This dried cheese was created by allowing milk to ferment in shallow pans until it formed a thick, yogurt-like consistency. The mixture was then spread thin and dried in the sun, creating sheets of concentrated dairy that could be rolled up and stored for extended periods. The taste of izjai was intensely concentrated, with a sharp, acidic flavor that could overwhelm unprepared palates. It possessed a chewy, almost rubbery texture that required significant jaw strength to consume. Mongols would often rehydrate small pieces in hot water or tea, creating a protein-rich broth that sustained them during difficult times. The fermentation process also produced byproducts that the Mongols utilized with characteristic efficiency. The whey left over from cheesemaking was never discarded, but instead fermented into a mildly alcoholic beverage called chiji. This thin, sour liquid provided additional nutrition and served as a safer alternative to water, which was often contaminated or scarce on the steppes. Seasonal variations in dairy production created additional challenges and opportunities. During spring and early summer, when mares were producing peak quantities of milk, Mongol families would work frantically to process and preserve as much as possible. The abundance of fresh milk allowed for experimentation with different fermentation techniques and aging processes. Winter dairy production presented entirely different challenges. With limited fresh milk available, families relied heavily on their stores of dried and fermented products. The frozen arul and izjai would be carefully rationed, with each piece representing precious calories and nutrition that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The cultural significance of these dairy products extended far beyond mere sustenance. Arak played a central role in Mongol religious ceremonies and social gatherings. The first taste of newly fermented arak marked seasonal celebrations, while the quality of a family's dairy products reflected their skill, status, and prosperity within the community. Guests were always offered arak as a sign of hospitality, and refusing this gesture was considered deeply insulting. Foreign diplomats and traders learned to endure the taste and digestive consequences rather than risk offending their Mongol hosts. The shared consumption of arak created bonds of friendship and trust that transcended cultural boundaries. The Mongols' mastery of dairy fermentation represented a sophisticated understanding of food preservation that allowed them to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. Their techniques, developed over centuries of nomadic life, created a sustainable food system that required no external inputs beyond the animals they herded, and the natural fermentation processes they had learned to control. The Mongols were, above all else, a people of meat. In their vast empire stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, vegetables were viewed with suspicion. Grains were tolerated when necessary, but meat was life itself. Yet the methods they used to procure, prepare, and preserve this precious protein would horrify any modern food safety inspector. Picture this scene from a 13th century Mongol camp. Warriors have just returned from a successful hunt, dragging behind them the carcass of a wild horse. The animal is still warm, steam rising from its body in the cold morning air. Without ceremony, without washing their hands, without any of the sanitary precautions we take for granted today, the Mongols begin their butchering process right there on the ground. The first cuts are made with knives that have seen countless battles, stained with blood, both human and animal. These same blades that split enemy skulls now slice through muscle and sinew. The Mongols waste nothing. Every part of the animal serves a purpose, from the hide that will become leather to the bones that will be carved into tools. But here's where things get truly unsettling. The Mongols had a peculiar relationship with freshness. While we obsess over expiration dates and refrigeration, they often preferred their meat in various stages of decay. Fresh meat was certainly consumed, but aged meat that had been hanging in the sun for days or weeks, was considered a delicacy. This preference wasn't born from ignorance, but from necessity and tradition. On the steppes, where temperatures could swing from scorching heat to bitter cold within hours, proper preservation meant the difference between survival and starvation. The Mongols developed techniques that would make a modern stomach turn, but kept their armies fed across impossible distances. One of their most infamous preservation methods was called boards. This was meat that had been cut into thin strips and hung in the open air to dry. But this wasn't the clean, controlled process of modern jerky making. The meat hung exposed to dust, insects, would lay their eggs in the drying flesh, and the Mongols would simply brush off the maggots before eating. The process of making boards was a community affair. Women and children would work together, cutting meat into precise strips, each about the width of a finger. These strips were then hung on wooden frames or draped over the sides of their felt tents. The constant movement of the nomadic lifestyle meant this meat was perpetually exposed to the elements, gathering dust from the trail and moisture from sudden rainstorms. But boards was just the beginning. The Mongols also practiced a form of preservation that involved burying meat in the ground. They would dig shallow pits, line them with animal hides, and pack the meat inside with salt when available, or simply with the alkaline soil of the steppes. The meat would ferment underground, developing a strong, pungent flavor that could be smelled from considerable distances. This buried meat, called suck, would be left for weeks or even months. When finally unearthed, it would be black on the outside, slimy to the touch, and emit an odor so powerful that even the Mongols themselves had to hold their breath while preparing it. Yet, this putrid-seeming substance was considered a valuable source of nutrition, packed with the kind of preserved proteins that could sustain a warrior through long campaigns. The consumption of raw meat was another cornerstone of Mongol cuisine that would appall modern sensibilities. Fresh kills were often eaten immediately, with warriors cutting chunks of warm flesh directly from the carcass and consuming it without any cooking whatsoever. The blood was drunk while still warm, considered a vital source of strength and vitality. But perhaps most disturbing was their method of tenderizing tough meat. When faced with particularly stringy or difficult cuts, Mongol horsemen would place the raw meat under their saddles. As they rode, the constant pressure and movement would break down the muscle fibers, while the salt from their horses' sweat would cure the meat. After a full day of riding, this saddle-tenderized meat would be consumed raw, seasoned with horse sweat, and whatever dirt and debris had accumulated during the journey. The Mongols also had a unique approach to cooking when they did choose to prepare their meat. Without access to proper cooking vessels during their constant travels, they would often use the stomachs of slaughtered animals as cooking pots. The stomach would be filled with meat, water, and whatever seasonings were available, then suspended over a fire. The stomach itself would eventually cook and become part of the meal. This method, while resourceful, created its own set of problems. The stomach lining would often burst during cooking, spilling the contents into the fire and creating a smoky, acrid mess. The meat that did cook properly would be flavored with the gastric juices and partially digested contents of the animal's last meal, creating a taste that was uniquely Mongol. Blood sausages were another staple, but again, the Mongol version differed significantly from anything we might recognize today. Fresh blood would be mixed with chunks of fat, pieces of organ meat, and whatever grains were available, then stuffed into intestines that had been cleaned only by scraping, not washing. These sausages would be eaten fresh or dried for later consumption. The drying process for these blood sausages was particularly unappetizing. They would be hung in the same areas as the boards, exposed to the same flies and dust. As they dried, they would shrink and wrinkle, taking on the appearance of something that had been dead for far longer than was probably safe to eat. Storage of preserved meat presented its own challenges. Without proper containers or controlled environments, the Mongols would often store their dried meat in leather bags that had been used for countless other purposes. These bags, made from animal hides that had been cured with urine and brain matter, would impart their own distinctive flavors to whatever was stored inside. The meat would often become infested with insects during storage, but this was considered a minor inconvenience rather than a serious problem. Warriors would simply shake out the bugs before eating, or in some cases, consume them along with the meat as an additional source of protein. As we drift deeper into this exploration of Mongol meat preservation, imagine the sounds of a 13th century camp at mealtime. The constant buzzing of flies, the wet sounds of tearing flesh, the satisfied grunts of warriors consuming their preserved provisions. These were the dinner sounds of an empire that conquered half the known world, fueled by meat that would be condemned by any modern health department. Beyond the fermented mare's milk and dried meat, the Mongols had another dietary practice that would make modern stomachs turn. They consumed virtually every part of their animals, including the blood and internal organs that most civilizations discarded as waste. Blood sausage wasn't just a delicacy for the Mongols. It was a necessity. When a horse or sheep was slaughtered, nothing could be wasted on the steppes. The blood would be collected in the animal's own stomach lining, mixed with chunks of fat and small pieces of meat, then tied off and boiled. The result was a dark, gelatinous sausage that could be stored for weeks without spoiling. The texture was reportedly similar to thick pudding, but with a metallic taste that coated the mouth. European travelers described it as slippery and difficult to chew, with an overwhelming iron flavor that lingered long after eating. Yet, for the Mongols, this blood sausage provided essential nutrients, particularly iron, that were crucial for their nomadic lifestyle. But blood sausage was just the beginning. The Mongols consumed virtually every organ of their animals, each prepared in ways that maximized nutrition while minimizing waste. The liver was often eaten raw, sliced thin, and consumed immediately after slaughter while it was still warm. This provided massive amounts of vitamin A and iron, nutrients that were otherwise difficult to obtain on the steppes. The kidneys were typically roasted over open fires, their strong, urine-like flavor concentrated by the cooking process. Mongol warriors would eat them whole, chewing through the tough outer membrane to reach the dense, mineral-rich meat inside. The taste was described by Chinese chroniclers as overwhelmingly salty and bitter, with a texture like tough rubber. Perhaps most disturbing to outsiders was the Mongol practice of consuming the lungs. These organs were usually stuffed with blood and fat, then roasted until the outside formed a crispy shell. When bitten into, they would release a burst of blood and air, creating a sensation that medieval writers compared to biting into a bloody balloon. The heart was considered a delicacy, often reserved for warriors and leaders. It would be roasted whole over coals, the tough muscle fibers becoming chewy and dense. The taste was described as intensely metallic, with a texture so tough it required extensive chewing. Some accounts describe Mongol leaders ceremonially eating the hearts of particularly brave enemies, believing it would transfer their courage. Intestines served multiple purposes in Mongol cuisine. The small intestines were cleaned and used as natural casings for blood sausages and other preserved meats. The large intestines were often stuffed with a mixture of blood, fat, and grain, then boiled to create a dish that resembled a massive, dark sausage. The smell during cooking was reportedly so strong that it could be detected from great distances. The stomach lining itself was not wasted. After being used to store blood sausage, it would be cleaned and eaten as a chewy, rubbery delicacy. The texture was described as similar to thick leather, requiring extensive chewing to break down. The taste was mildly sour from the stomach acids, with an underlying flavor of whatever the animal had been eating. Even the brain was consumed, though this was typically reserved for special occasions. The skull would be cracked open and the brain extracted, then mixed with blood and fat to create a paste-like substance. This mixture was often spread on dried meat or consumed directly. The texture was creamy but grainy, with a taste that observers described as overwhelmingly rich and slightly sweet. The bone marrow was extracted by cracking open the long bones of legs and arms. This rich, fatty substance was considered a great delicacy and was often given to children and pregnant women. The marrow had a consistency similar to soft butter, but with an intensely concentrated meaty flavor that could be overwhelming to unaccustomed palates. Perhaps most unusual was the Mongol practice of consuming the eyes of their animals. These were typically roasted whole and eaten immediately, popping in the mouth to release a burst of fluid. The taste was described as mildly salty, with a texture that was simultaneously soft and chewy. The lens of the eye was particularly prized for its unique, jelly-like consistency. The tongue was another organ that required special preparation. It would be boiled for hours until the tough outer skin could be peeled away, revealing the tender muscle underneath. However, even after extensive cooking, the texture remained dense and chewy, with a flavor more concentrated than regular meat. The root of the tongue was considered the best part, being more tender than the tip. fresh blood was also consumed directly, particularly during times of extreme hardship. Warriors would sometimes drink the blood of their horses without killing them, opening a small vein and drinking directly. This practice provided immediate nutrition and hydration, though the taste was described as overwhelmingly metallic and warm, with a consistency thicker than water, but thinner than milk. The preparation of these organ meats required specific techniques to make them palatable. Most organs were heavily salted and dried, concentrating their flavors while preserving them for long journeys. The salt would draw out moisture while intensifying the already strong tastes, creating foods that were nutritious but challenging to modern sensibilities. Cooking methods were limited by the nomadic lifestyle. Most organ meats were either roasted over open fires or boiled in large metal pots. The roasting process would create a crispy exterior while leaving the interior soft and bloody. Boiling, while more thorough, often resulted in a gray, unappetizing appearance that did nothing to improve the already challenging flavors. The social aspects of organ consumption were also significant. Certain organs were reserved for specific members of society. The heart and liver typically went to warriors and leaders, while the less desirable organs like lungs and intestines were given to women and children. This hierarchy of organ distribution reflected the broader social structure of Mongol society. These practices weren't born from preference, but from necessity. The harsh steppes provided limited food sources, making it essential to utilize every part of available animals. What seemed disgusting to outsiders was actually a sophisticated system of nutrition that allowed the Mongols to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. The nutritional benefits were undeniable. Organ meats provided vitamins and minerals that were impossible to obtain from muscle meat alone. The iron from blood and liver prevented anemia, while the vitamin A from liver supported vision and immune function. These nutrients were crucial for maintaining the health and strength necessary for their nomadic lifestyle. As we've seen, the Mongol consumption of blood and organs was both practical and necessary, though it created some of the most challenging flavors and textures in their already difficult cuisine. But their dietary practices extended beyond just what they ate to how they prepared and preserved their food, often in ways that would seem equally strange to modern sensibilities. While the Mongols struggled with basic nutrition and food safety, they found solace in fermented beverages that would make modern drinkers question their life choices. The steppe peoples had perfected the art of turning any available liquid into alcohol, creating drinks that served as both sustenance and social lubricant in their harsh nomadic existence. The most famous of these beverages was arag, fermented mare's milk, that became the cornerstone of Mongol drinking culture. The process began with milking mares multiple times throughout the day, a task that required considerable skill and patience. Mongol women would collect the milk in large leather bags made from horsehide, where the real magic happened through constant agitation and the addition of starter cultures from previous batches. The fermentation process was both fascinating and revolting by modern standards. The leather bags would be hung from the ceiling of the jar, and family members would take turns beating and stirring the contents with wooden paddles throughout the day. This constant movement prevented the milk from separating, while encouraging the growth of beneficial bacteria and wild yeasts that converted the lactose into alcohol and lactic acid. After 3 to 5 days of this relentless agitation, the mare's milk would transform into a slightly alcoholic beverage with a tangy, sour taste and a consistency somewhere between thin yogurt and watery beer. The alcohol content typically ranged from 2 to 3%, making it strong enough to provide a mild buzz, but weak enough to consume throughout the day without complete intoxication. The taste of arak was described by various travelers as an acquired preference that most foreigners found challenging to appreciate. Marco Polo noted that it had a sharp, acidic flavor with hints of cheese and alcohol, while other visitors compared it to sour milk mixed with vinegar. The drink would often develop a slight fizz from the fermentation process, adding to its unique character. Beyond mare's milk, the Mongols fermented virtually any animal milk they could obtain. Cow's milk was processed into a drink called arkai, which underwent a more intensive fermentation and distillation process. The Mongols would heat the fermented milk in large copper pots, collecting the alcohol-rich vapors that condensed on specially designed lids and dripped into collection vessels. This distillation process created a much stronger beverage, often reaching alcohol levels of 20 to 30%. Arkai was reserved for special occasions and important guests, as it required significantly more time and resources to produce than simple fermented milk. The taste was described as harsh and burning, with a distinct milky undertone that reminded drinkers of its dairy origins. Sheep and goat milk also found their way into Mongol brewing practices, though these were considered inferior to horse milk for fermentation purposes. The different milk compositions created beverages with varying flavors and alcohol contents, but all shared the common characteristics of sourness and an acquired taste that challenged foreign palates. The social importance of these alcoholic beverages cannot be overstated in Mongol culture. Offering arab to guests was a fundamental aspect of hospitality, and refusing to drink was considered a serious insult. The Khan himself would often begin important meetings by sharing drinks with his advisors and visitors, using alcohol as a diplomatic tool to build relationships and demonstrate trust. During religious ceremonies and seasonal celebrations, the consumption of fermented beverages took on spiritual significance. Shamans would offer arak to the spirits of the ancestors and the eternal blue sky, believing that the fermented milk carried prayers and wishes to the divine realm. The slight intoxication from the alcohol was thought to facilitate communication with the spirit world. The Mongols also developed various flavored versions of their fermented beverages by adding herbs, berries, and other available ingredients. Wild mint, juniper berries, and various steppe plants would be mixed into the fermenting milk to create unique flavors and potentially beneficial medicinal properties. These additions helped mask some of the more challenging aspects of the base beverages, while adding complexity to the drinking experience. Storage and preservation of these alcoholic beverages presented constant challenges in the nomadic lifestyle. The leather containers would develop their own microbial ecosystems over time, contributing to the flavor profile, but also creating potential health hazards. The bags would become increasingly sour and pungent with age, developing thick, gelatinous layers that had to be strained out before drinking. During winter months, the fermented beverages would often freeze solid, requiring careful thawing processes that could affect both flavor and alcohol content. The Mongols learned to manage these seasonal challenges by adjusting their fermentation techniques and storage methods, though the quality of their drinks inevitably suffered during the harshest weather conditions. The production of alcoholic beverages also created interesting social dynamics within Mongol communities. Women typically managed the fermentation process, giving them significant control over an important aspect of daily life and social interaction. The quality of a family's arag could enhance their reputation and social standing, making fermentation skills highly valued among Mongol women. Foreign visitors often struggled not only with the taste of these beverages, but also with the social expectations surrounding their consumption. Diplomatic missions would sometimes fail or succeed based partly on the visitor's willingness to participate in drinking rituals and their ability to maintain composure while consuming these challenging beverages. The health implications of constant consumption of fermented milk products were mixed. While the fermentation process did provide some beneficial probiotics and helped preserve nutrients, the alcohol content and the questionable sanitary conditions of production created their own health risks. The acidic nature of the drinks could cause digestive problems, especially for those unaccustomed to such beverages. As the Mongol Empire expanded and encountered other cultures, they began incorporating new alcoholic beverages into their drinking repertoire. Chinese rice wine, Persian grape wine, and various grain-based alcohols were adopted and adapted to Mongol tastes and social customs. Though fermented mare's milk remained the preferred drink of the traditional steppe peoples, the legacy of these fermented beverages continues in modern Mongolia, where arag remains a traditional drink served during special occasions and cultural celebrations. However, modern production methods have significantly improved both the safety and palatability of these ancient beverages, though they retain their distinctive character and cultural significance. These alcoholic beverages represented more than mere sustenance or intoxication for the Mongols. They embodied the ingenuity required to survive in harsh environments, the social bonds that held communities together, and the spiritual beliefs that gave meaning to nomadic life, all while challenging the taste buds and stomachs of anyone brave enough to partake in this fermented tradition. The cooking methods available to Mongol herders were as limited as their ingredients, shaped entirely by the demands of constant movement and the harsh realities of steppe life. Every piece of equipment had to be portable, durable, and serve multiple purposes, leading to cooking techniques that prioritized survival over flavor. The most essential cooking vessel in any Mongol household was the iron cauldron, a heavy but indispensable pot that could withstand the rigors of daily use and constant transport. These cauldrons, often passed down through generations, were the centerpiece of Mongol cooking, used for everything from boiling meat to rendering fat to preparing the endless pots of tea that sustained nomadic life. The cauldron's design was perfectly suited to nomadic needs. Its rounded bottom distributed heat evenly over the open flames of dried dung fires, while its thick iron walls could withstand the thermal shock of sudden temperature changes. The handles were forged as part of the vessel itself, eliminating weak points that might break during transport across the bumpy terrain of the steppes. Boiling was by far the most common cooking method, not by choice, but by necessity. The Mongols would fill their cauldrons with water, often melted snow or ice during winter months, and bring it to a rolling boil over fires fueled by dried animal dung. Into this boiling, water went chunks of mutton, horse meat, or whatever animal had been recently slaughtered, along with any available dairy products. This method of cooking, while monotonous, served several practical purposes. Boiling killed harmful bacteria and parasites that might be present in the meat, crucial for people who often consumed animals that had died from disease or injury. The resulting broth provided essential nutrients and hydration, particularly important during long journeys when water sources might be scarce or contaminated. The Mongols also developed a unique cooking technique, using the stomach of freshly slaughtered animals as a natural cooking vessel. They would clean the stomach thoroughly, fill it with chunks of meat and fat, seal it tightly, and then place it directly into the coals of their fire. The stomach would cook from the outside while steaming the contents within, creating a self-contained cooking system that required no additional vessels. This stomach cooking method, while ingenious, produced meat with a distinctly gamey flavor and unusual texture. The natural enzymes present in the stomach lining would partially break down the proteins, creating a somewhat predigested consistency that many travelers found deeply unsettling. The meat would emerge from this process with a grayish color and a taste that combined the flavors of the animal's last meal with the metallic tang of blood. For cooking smaller portions, or when fuel was particularly scarce, the Mongols employed a technique called stone boiling. They would heat stones in their fire until they glowed red hot, then use wooden tongs to transfer these stones into vessels filled with water and raw ingredients. The superheated stones would bring the water to a rapid boil, cooking the contents without requiring a sustained fire. Stone boiling was particularly useful during winter storms when maintaining an open fire became impossible. The technique allowed for cooking inside the jur, using stones heated during brief breaks in the weather. However, this method often imparted a mineral taste to the food, as the heated stones would sometimes crack or chip, releasing fragments into the cooking liquid. The Mongols possessed very few cutting implements, relying primarily on a single knife that served multiple purposes. This knife, typically worn at the belt, was used for everything from slaughtering animals to cutting meat to eating. The blade was kept sharp through constant use against leather strops, but the lack of proper sharpening stones meant that most knives were never truly sharp by modern standards. Without proper cutting boards or surfaces, the Mongols would butcher animals directly on the ground, often on hides spread for the purpose. This practice inevitably introduced dirt, hair, and other contaminants into the meat, which would then be carried into the cooking pot. The resulting meals contained a gritty texture that became so commonplace that clean food would have seemed unusual to Mongol palates. Roasting over open flames was occasionally practiced, but only when fuel was abundant and the weather permitted maintaining a steady fire. The Mongols would skewer chunks of meat on wooden or metal spits, rotating them slowly over the coals. However, the constant wind of the steppes made this method unpredictable, often resulting in meat that was charred on the outside while remaining raw within. The lack of proper roasting equipment meant that meat was often cooked directly on the coals, leading to a distinctive charcoal flavor that permeated every bite. Ash and ember fragments would adhere to the meat's surface, creating a gritty, acrid taste that combined with the natural flavors of the meat in unpleasant ways. Smoking meat was practiced primarily as a preservation method rather than a cooking technique. The Mongols would construct simple smoking structures using bent branches and animal hides, creating enclosed spaces where meat could be exposed to smoke from smoldering dung fires. This process could take several days, during which the meat would develop a leathery texture and intensely smoky flavor. The smoking process was often incomplete due to the unpredictable nature of dung fires and the need to move camp frequently. Partially smoked meat would be consumed in various states of preservation, from barely dried to completely desiccated, each stage offering its own unique and often unpalatable characteristics. Dairy processing required its own specialized equipment, most notably the leather bags used for churning butter, and the wooden vessels used for fermenting mares, milk into arrack. These containers, made from treated animal skins, imparted their own flavors to the dairy products, creating tastes that were foreign and often offensive to visitors from agricultural societies. The constant motion of nomadic life actually aided in dairy processing, as the natural movement of horses and camels would churn milk during transport, separating butter and creating fermented products without additional effort. However, this process was uncontrolled and unpredictable, often resulting in dairy products with inconsistent textures and flavors. The Mongols' cooking methods, while perfectly adapted to their nomadic lifestyle, produced food that was challenging even by medieval standards. Every technique prioritized portability and preservation over palatability, creating a cuisine that sustained life, but offered little in the way of culinary pleasure. These methods would remain largely unchanged for centuries, defining Mongol food culture and contributing to their reputation for consuming some of the most unappetizing meals in the medieval world. Beyond the practical aspects of Mongol cuisine lay a complex web of beliefs and taboos that governed every aspect of food consumption. These weren't mere superstitions, but deeply ingrained cultural practices that shaped how the Mongols interacted with their food, their animals, and their spiritual world. The most fundamental taboo in Mongol culture revolved around the treatment of fire and water. Fire was considered sacred, the dwelling place of ancestral spirits, and the divine force that connected earth to sky. This meant that throwing anything dirty into a fire was strictly forbidden. Food scraps, bones, or any waste could never be burned. Instead, these remnants had to be carefully disposed of in specific ways that wouldn't anger the fire spirits. Water held similar sacred status. The Mongols believed that contaminating water sources would bring terrible misfortune upon the entire tribe. This created elaborate rituals around food preparation near rivers or wells. Cooking vessels had to be cleaned downstream from drinking areas, and certain foods could never be prepared near moving water. The belief was so strong that violating these water taboos could result in exile or death. The slaughter of animals was surrounded by an intricate system of beliefs and practices. Each animal had to be killed in a specific way that honored its spirit and ensured its soul could properly transition to the afterlife. For sheep and goats, this meant making a small incision in the chest and reaching inside to pinch the aorta, causing the animal to die without spilling blood on the ground. The blood was considered sacred and had to be caught and consumed or used in specific rituals. Horses held the most complex set of taboos. These animals were so revered that their meat could only be consumed during specific ceremonies or times of extreme necessity. When a horse was slaughtered, every part of the animal had to be used, and the bones had to be buried in a specific orientation that would allow the horse's spirit to continue serving its master in the afterlife. The fermented mare's milk, arag, came with its own set of restrictions about who could drink it and when. Certain body parts of animals were considered especially powerful or dangerous. The liver was believed to contain the animal's life force and could only be consumed by specific members of the tribe, usually shamans or tribal elders. The heart had to be eaten immediately after slaughter, while still warm, to capture the animal's strength and courage. The brain was reserved for pregnant women and children, as it was thought to enhance intelligence and spiritual awareness. The Mongols also maintained strict taboos about eating certain animals entirely. Dogs were considered sacred guardians of the camp and could never be consumed, even during times of starvation. Cats were believed to be connected to evil spirits and were avoided completely. Birds of prey were considered messengers of the sky god Tengri and were absolutely forbidden as food. Even their feathers couldn't be used for decoration or practical purposes. Food sharing followed rigid hierarchical rules that reflected the social structure of Mongol society. The Khan, or tribal leader, always received the first and best portions of any meal. This included specific cuts of meat, the richest dairy products, and the first taste of any fermented beverages. Violating these hierarchical food customs was considered an act of rebellion against the natural order and could result in severe punishment. Women faced particular restrictions around food preparation and consumption. During menstruation, women were considered spiritually unclean and couldn't prepare food for others or participate in communal meals. Pregnant women had their own set of dietary taboos, including avoiding certain types of meat that were believed to cause difficult births or deformed children. These restrictions often meant that women had to maintain separate cooking areas and eating schedules. The timing of meals was governed by spiritual beliefs about the movement of the sun and moon. Certain foods could only be eaten during daylight hours, while others were reserved for nighttime consumption. The new moon brought restrictions on dairy products, while the full moon enhanced the power of fermented beverages. These celestial influences meant that Mongol meals were carefully planned around astronomical events. Guests and strangers faced their own set of food-related protocols. Refusing offered food was considered a grave insult that could lead to blood feuds between tribes. However, accepting food also created obligations and spiritual bonds that could last for generations. The guest had to eat everything offered, regardless of personal preferences or dietary restrictions, and had to praise the host's generosity and cooking skills. The Mongols believed that certain food combinations could create spiritual imbalances or attract evil spirits. Mixing dairy products with certain types of meat was thought to cause illness or bad luck. Combining foods from different animals required specific rituals to prevent the animal spirits from fighting within the consumer's body. These beliefs created complex meal planning that went far beyond simple nutrition or taste preferences. Seasonal food taboos reflected the Mongols' deep connection to natural cycles. During the spring birthing season, consuming young animals was forbidden until specific rituals had been performed to ensure the continued fertility of the herds. Summer brought restrictions on certain dairy products that were believed to interfere with the animals' milk production. Winter food taboos focused on preserving enough resources to survive until spring. The storage and preservation of food was surrounded by spiritual protections and taboos. Food containers had to be blessed by shamans and positioned in specific orientations within the jar to prevent spoilage and ward off evil spirits. Certain preserved foods could only be opened during specific ceremonies, while others required ritual purification before consumption. These practices ensured that food remained not just physically safe, but spiritually clean. Violations of food taboos were believed to bring immediate and severe consequences. Illness, bad weather, failed hunts, and military defeats were all attributed to improper food handling or consumption. The entire tribe could suffer for one person's violation of food customs, creating intense social pressure to maintain these traditions. Shamans performed elaborate purification rituals to cleanse the spiritual contamination caused by broken food taboos. These intricate beliefs and restrictions created a food culture that was as much about spiritual practice as physical sustenance. Every meal was a religious ceremony, every bite a connection to the divine and ancestral worlds. For the Mongols, food wasn't just fuel for the body, but nourishment for the soul, governed by ancient wisdom that had guided their people across the vast steppes for countless generations. The Mongol diet shifted dramatically with the seasons, creating a complex cycle of feast and famine that shaped their entire culinary culture. Spring brought the most challenging period, when winter stores dwindled and fresh resources remained scarce. During these lean months, Mongols relied heavily on mare's milk and the first tender shoots of grass that their animals could digest. The spring diet was particularly monotonous, consisting mainly of arag and whatever dried meat remained from the previous autumn's slaughter. Summer represented the peak of Mongol culinary abundance, though abundance is a relative term when discussing their limited food sources. The warm months allowed for the production of various fermented dairy products, including dried curds that could be stored for months. Mongols would prepare arul, or dried cheese curds, by spreading fresh curds on felt mats and allowing them to dry in the sun and wind. These rock-hard pieces provided essential nutrition during travel and could be softened in tea or broth when needed. The summer hunting season brought welcome variety to the Mongol diet, though their hunting practices often shocked visitors from agricultural societies. Mongols would organize massive communal hunts called batu, where entire tribes would form enormous circles spanning miles, and gradually close in on trapped animals. These hunts could last for days and would capture everything from rabbits to deer, providing fresh meat that was immediately consumed or preserved for winter storage. Fish represented another summer food source, though Mongols generally avoided fishing due to cultural taboos associated with water spirits. When they did consume fish, it was typically during times of extreme necessity or when influenced by conquered peoples who maintained fishing traditions. The preparation of fish followed similar patterns to other meats, with extensive use of salt and drying techniques to preserve the catch for later consumption. Autumn marked the most crucial period in the Mongol food calendar, as this was when families prepared for the harsh winter months ahead. The autumn slaughter, or winter preparation, involved killing a significant portion of the herd to provide meat for the cold season. This process required careful calculation, as families needed to balance immediate food needs with maintaining sufficient breeding stock for the following year. The slaughter typically focused on older animals and excess males, preserving the most productive females for continued milk production and reproduction. The preservation techniques employed during autumn slaughter were sophisticated and essential for survival. Mongols would cut meat into long strips and hang them in the dry autumn air, creating jerky that could last throughout the winter. They also prepared a concentrated meat paste called boards, which involved grinding dried meat into powder and mixing it with fat. This highly nutritious mixture could be stored in leather bags and provided quick energy during winter travels or emergencies. Winter brought the harshest dietary restrictions, when fresh food became virtually impossible to obtain. The Mongol winter diet consisted primarily of preserved meats, dried dairy products, and endless cups of salted tea. Families would carefully ration their stored foods, knowing that running out before spring could mean starvation. The psychological impact of this seasonal scarcity influenced Mongol attitudes toward food sharing and hospitality, creating cultural norms that emphasized generous feeding of guests, even during lean times. The preparation of winter meals required creativity and resourcefulness, as cooks worked with limited ingredients to create filling and nutritious dishes. Mongols would create hearty stews by combining small amounts of preserved meat with dried vegetables and grains obtained through trade. These stews were often quite salty due to the preservation methods used, and they provided essential calories and nutrients during the coldest months of the year. Seasonal variations also affected the types of dairy products available to Mongol families. Spring and summer brought fresh milk and the opportunity to create soft cheeses and fresh butter, while autumn required the conversion of excess milk into dried products that could survive winter storage. The timing of these dairy preparations was crucial, as improper preservation could result in spoilage and the loss of vital winter nutrition. The seasonal diet cycle created distinct cultural practices around food sharing and community support. During abundant summer months, Mongol families would often share excess dairy products with neighbors, knowing that such generosity would be reciprocated during leaner times. These reciprocal relationships formed the foundation of Mongol social organization and helped ensure community survival during harsh winters. Seasonal hunting patterns also influenced the variety of game available throughout the year. Spring hunting focused on small game and birds, while summer allowed for larger communal hunts. Autumn hunting concentrated on building winter meat stores, and winter hunting was typically limited to opportunistic kills of animals that wandered close to settlements. Each season brought different challenges and opportunities for supplementing the basic diet of dairy and preserved meat. The impact of seasonal variations extended beyond mere food availability to influence Mongol migration patterns and settlement decisions. Tribes would time their movements to coincide with optimal grazing conditions and seasonal food sources, creating complex annual cycles that balanced animal needs with human nutritional requirements. These seasonal movements required careful planning and coordination, as poor timing could result in inadequate food supplies during critical periods. Understanding these seasonal dietary patterns helps explain many aspects of Mongol culture and military organization. The ability to survive on limited and monotonous food sources prepared Mongol warriors for the hardships of long military campaigns, while their seasonal preservation techniques provided the foundation for supplying armies across vast distances. The cyclical nature of feast and famine created a people uniquely adapted to the challenges of nomadic life and military conquest. The Mongol Empire's rapid expansion across continents brought unprecedented challenges to their traditional food systems. As armies swept across diverse landscapes, from the steppes of Central Asia to the rice paddies of China, the Mongols faced a fundamental question. How do you maintain your dietary identity while conquering the world? The answer lay in a complex process of adaptation that would forever change both Mongol cuisine and the eating habits of their conquered territories. The Mongol forces first encountered agricultural societies. The clash wasn't just military, it was culinary. The nomadic diet of fermented mare's milk, dried meat, and blood-based sustenance met the grain-heavy, vegetable-rich cuisines of settled civilizations. Initially, many Mongol warriors viewed these foreign foods with suspicion and disgust. Rice, to people accustomed to dairy and meat, seemed like bird feed. Bread, with its soft texture and grain-based composition, felt alien to palates trained on tough, chewy, dried meats. The logistics of feeding massive armies during extended campaigns forced rapid dietary evolution. Traditional Mongol foods like arak and borts were perfect for small, mobile groups on familiar terrain. But when armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands and campaigns lasted years, the old ways simply couldn't sustain the war machine. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles, and the familiar herds of horses and cattle couldn't possibly feed such massive forces in foreign lands. Chinese agricultural techniques introduced the Mongols to entirely new categories of food. Grains like millet, wheat, and rice became strategic necessities rather than dietary choices. The Mongols learned to appreciate the efficiency of grain production. A single acre could feed far more people with cultivated crops than with grazing animals. This realization was both practical and disturbing to a culture that had defined itself through its relationship with livestock. The adaptation process wasn't smooth or immediate. Many Mongol commanders initially tried to maintain traditional diets, even in conquered territories. They would demand tribute in the form of horses and cattle, attempting to recreate steppe conditions in completely unsuitable environments. These efforts often led to ecological disasters, as grazing animals devastated agricultural lands not designed to support them. The environmental destruction was so severe that some regions took decades to recover. Gradually, pragmatic Mongol leaders began incorporating local foods into military rations. Chinese noodles made from wheat flour became popular among Mongol troops because they were portable, nutritious, and could be prepared quickly. The texture was initially off-putting, too soft compared to the tough, chewy consistency of traditional Mongol foods. But hunger and practicality overcame cultural preferences. These early noodle dishes were often prepared with whatever meat was available, creating fusion cuisines that would influence Asian cooking for centuries. The conquest of Persia introduced the Mongols to an entirely different culinary universe. Persian cuisine, with its complex spice blends, rice-based dishes, and sophisticated cooking techniques, was far more elaborate than anything in the Mongol culinary tradition. The use of saffron, cardamom, and other exotic spices was initially viewed with suspicion. Many Mongol warriors believed that heavily spiced food was somehow weakening or effeminate, associating the complex flavors with the perceived softness of settled peoples. However, Persian cooking methods proved invaluable for preserving food during long campaigns. The Persian technique of cooking rice with meat and spices created dishes that could feed large numbers of people efficiently while providing better nutrition than simple grains alone. Mongol cooks began adapting these methods, creating simplified versions that could be prepared in field conditions. The resulting dishes were often quite different from their Persian origins, less refined, more focused on quantity and practicality than on subtle flavors. The integration of Islamic dietary laws presented unique challenges for Mongol forces operating in Muslim territories. The prohibition against pork was relatively easy to accommodate, as pigs weren't part of traditional Mongol animal husbandry anyway. However, the Islamic emphasis on ritual slaughter and the prohibition against consuming blood directly conflicted with fundamental Mongol practices. Blood sausages and fresh blood drinks, staples of steppe cuisine, became problematic when trying to maintain local alliances and govern Muslim populations. Some Mongol leaders found creative solutions to these dietary conflicts. They would maintain traditional practices within their inner circles while adopting local customs for public consumption and diplomatic purposes. This dual approach allowed them to preserve cultural identity while demonstrating respect for local traditions. However, it also created internal tensions within Mongol society. As younger generations began to prefer the local cuisines, they grew up with over-traditional steppe foods. The conquest of Eastern Europe introduced the Mongols to yet another set of dietary challenges. The colder climate and different agricultural patterns meant that food preservation techniques had to be adapted once again. European methods of smoking meats and preserving vegetables through fermentation offered new possibilities for maintaining food supplies during harsh winters. These techniques were particularly valuable because they could be applied to traditional Mongol foods, creating hybrid preservation methods that worked in diverse climates. Trade routes established by Mongol conquests created unprecedented opportunities for culinary exchange. Spices from Southeast Asia, preserved foods from China, and fermentation techniques from various cultures all began flowing along the Silk Road. This exchange wasn't just about luxury items for the elite. It fundamentally changed how ordinary people ate across the empire. Mongol administrators actively promoted this culinary exchange because it helped create economic prosperity and cultural stability in conquered territories. The adaptation process also worked in reverse, as conquered peoples began incorporating Mongol foods into their own cuisines. Fermented dairy products, previously unknown in many agricultural societies, became popular in regions under Mongol control. The Mongol emphasis on meat consumption influenced local cooking styles, leading to heartier, more protein-rich dishes in areas that had previously relied heavily on grains and vegetables. By the height of the empire, Mongol cuisine had become a complex fusion of influences from across Eurasia. A typical meal for a Mongol official might include Chinese noodles, Persian rice dishes, fermented mare's milk, and European-style preserved meats. This culinary diversity reflected the empire's unprecedented scope, but also marked a departure from the simple, uniform diet that had sustained the original nomadic warriors. The transformation was so complete that many traditional Mongol foods became rare, even among the Mongol elite, preserved only in the most remote regions of the steppes. This dietary evolution during the conquest period reveals how profoundly the Mongol Empire changed through its own success. The simple, harsh foods that had created the world's greatest nomadic warriors gave way to a complex, cosmopolitan cuisine that reflected the empire's vast diversity. In adapting to feed their conquests, the Mongols had fundamentally transformed their own relationship with food, creating a legacy that that would influence Eurasian cuisine for centuries to come. While common Mongols endured harsh dietary realities, the imperial court developed its own elaborate food culture that was equally disturbing in different ways. The Great Khan's table became a theater of excess, waste, and bizarre culinary experiments that would make even the most adventurous modern foodie recoil in horror. At the heart of Mongol court dining lay the concept of arag fountains. These weren't decorative water features, but actual functioning dispensers of fermented mare's milk that flowed continuously during banquets. Imagine walking into a palace and seeing streams of chunky, alcoholic horse milk cascading from ornate silver spouts, the smell of fermentation filling the air as nobles gathered around with their cups. The construction of these fountains required constant maintenance by specialized servants who had to ensure the arag didn't spoil or become too thick to flow properly. The fermented milk would often develop a skin on top, creating a film that had to be skimmed regularly. Guests would sometimes find chunks of curdled milk in their cups, which was considered perfectly normal and even desirable for its supposed health benefits. Court banquets featured what can only be described as competitive eating on a massive scale. The Mongol nobility didn't just eat to satisfy hunger. They ate to demonstrate power, wealth, and their ability to consume vast quantities of food. A typical imperial feast would last for hours, with course after course of increasingly elaborate and often revolting dishes. One particularly disturbing court tradition involved the consumption of what they called thousand-year eggs, though these weren't the preserved duck eggs known by that name today. These were actual bird eggs that had been buried in horse dung and left to ferment for months. The shells would turn black and brittle, and when cracked open, they revealed a gelatinous, dark green interior with an overwhelming ammonia smell. The texture was described by Persian visitors as similar to thick mucus, with a flavor that combined the worst aspects of rotten fish and fermented cheese. Yet, consuming these eggs was considered a mark of sophistication among the Mongol elite, who would compete to see who could eat the most without showing disgust. Imperial hunting parties created their own category of culinary horror. When the Khan went hunting, massive entourages would follow, including cooks who were expected to prepare fresh kills immediately in the field. This led to the practice of consuming animals that were barely dead, sometimes still warm and twitching. The Mongols believed that eating meat while it was still alive with energy would transfer the animal's strength to the consumer. This meant that deer, wild boar, and even bears would be partially butchered and consumed while their hearts were still beating. The sight of nobles tearing into raw, bloody meat while the animal's eyes were still clear was reportedly common at these outdoor feasts. Court cooks developed increasingly bizarre methods of food preparation to impress their rulers. One documented technique involved stuffing live fish into the stomach cavity of a freshly killed sheep, then roasting the entire assembly. The fish would cook inside the sheep's stomach acids, creating what was described as an intensely sour and fishy flavor that permeated the entire meal. Another imperial delicacy involved fermenting entire small animals, such as marmots or rabbits, in large clay pots buried underground. These would be left for months until the meat had completely broken down into a paste-like consistency. The resulting substance was considered so potent that it was believed to cure various ailments, though the smell was reportedly so intense that it could clear a room. The Mongol court's approach to vegetables was equally disturbing. Since fresh vegetables were rare and often viewed with suspicion, court cooks would preserve them using methods that rendered them nearly unrecognizable. Onions and garlic would be fermented in animal blood until they turned black and developed a metallic taste that was considered a delicacy. Root vegetables would be buried in pits lined with animal hides and left to ferment in their own juices mixed with mare's milk. The resulting mush had a consistency similar to baby food, but with an overwhelmingly sour and putrid flavor. Nobles would eat this mixture with ornate spoons made from carved bone, often the bones of enemies killed in battle. Perhaps most disturbing were the court's drinking customs. Beyond the ever-present arak, Mongol nobles consumed a beverage made from fermented horse blood mixed with milk and various herbs. This drink, called warrior strength, was thick, dark red, and had a metallic taste that was said to be acquired over time. The preparation of this drink involved bleeding horses regularly, collecting the blood in large leather containers, and allowing it to partially coagulate before mixing it with fermented milk. The resulting beverage had the consistency of thin pudding and would often contain chunks of coagulated blood that had to be chewed. Court banquets also featured what might be the most revolting dish in Mongol cuisine: fermented brain soup. This delicacy was made by removing the brains from various animals, mixing them with fermented mare's milk, and allowing the mixture to sit in the sun for several days until it developed a thick, custard-like consistency. The smell of this dish was reportedly so intense that it could be detected from several rooms away. The texture was described as grainy and lumpy, with pieces of brain tissue floating in the fermented milk. Yet this was considered one of the most prestigious dishes that could be served, reserved only for the most important guests and celebrations. The imperial court's food storage methods created additional health hazards. Large quantities of meat would be stored in underground chambers that were poorly ventilated and often contaminated with rodent droppings. The meat would develop a greenish tinge and a strong ammonia smell, but this was considered normal and even desirable for its supposed medicinal properties. These storage areas became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. leading to frequent outbreaks of food poisoning among the court. However, the Mongols attributed these illnesses to spiritual causes rather than food contamination, leading them to continue these dangerous practices for generations. The contrast between the imperial court's elaborate food rituals and the basic survival eating of common Mongols created a bizarre culinary hierarchy. While ordinary people struggled to find enough fermented milk and dried meat to survive, the elite gorged themselves on increasingly exotic and revolting delicacies that pushed the boundaries of what could be considered edible. This imperial food culture would eventually contribute to the empire's decline, as resources were diverted from practical concerns to supporting increasingly elaborate and wasteful court banquets. The Mongol elite became so disconnected from the realities of food production that they lost touch with the practical dietary knowledge that had made their ancestors successful nomadic warriors. As we reach the end of our journey through the culinary landscape of the Mongol Empire, it's worth reflecting on what we've discovered about food, survival, and adaptation in one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The Mongols created an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, and their food culture was both a product of necessity and a testament to human ingenuity in the face of harsh environmental conditions. Throughout this exploration, we've seen how the Mongols transformed what many would consider unpalatable ingredients into sustenance that could fuel the conquest of continents. Their fermented mare's milk, dried meat preparations, and innovative preservation techniques weren't merely survival strategies. They were sophisticated solutions to the challenges of nomadic life on the steppes. The blood sausages, fermented dairy products, and organ-based dishes that might seem revolting to modern palates were actually nutritionally dense foods that provided essential vitamins and minerals in an environment where fresh vegetables and fruits were scarce. The Mongol approach to food reveals something profound about human adaptability. When faced with limited resources and extreme conditions, they didn't simply make do, they innovated. They developed fermentation techniques that could preserve dairy products for months, created portable foods that could sustain armies across vast distances, and established trade networks that brought exotic spices and ingredients from conquered territories back to the steppes. Their willingness to incorporate foods from other cultures while maintaining their core dietary traditions demonstrates a pragmatic flexibility that contributed to their military and political success. Consider the broader implications of Mongol food culture on world history. Their preservation techniques influenced food preparation methods across Eurasia. The trade routes they established didn't just move silk and precious metals. They carried culinary knowledge, spices, and food preparation techniques that would eventually influence cuisines from Korea to Hungary. The Mongols' integration of Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian cooking methods created fusion cuisines that persisted long after their empire fragmented. The seasonal variations in Mongol diet that we explored reveal a deep understanding of ecological rhythms and resource management. Their ability to maximize nutrition from every part of an animal, their sophisticated understanding of fermentation processes, and their development of foods that could withstand extreme temperature variations, all demonstrate a level of food science that was remarkably advanced for its time. The spring hunger periods, summer abundance, autumn preparations, and winter survival strategies created a cyclical approach to nutrition that sustained entire populations through harsh continental climates. What's particularly fascinating is how Mongol food culture challenges our modern assumptions about what constitutes appetizing or nutritious food. Their consumption of blood, fermented dairy products, and organ meats provided essential nutrients that are often lacking in contemporary diets. The modern Western aversion to many of these foods reflects cultural conditioning rather than any inherent problem with the ingredients themselves. In many ways, the Mongol diet was more nutritionally complete and environmentally sustainable than many modern food systems. The social aspects of Mongol dining that we examined reveal how food served functions beyond mere sustenance. The communal consumption of arak, the ritualized sharing of meat during festivals, and the hierarchical distribution of food during feasts all reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. Food was a medium through which the Mongols expressed hospitality, demonstrated wealth, maintained social order, and preserved cultural traditions across their vast empire. The military implications of Mongol food culture cannot be overstated. Their ability to create portable, long-lasting foods that required minimal preparation gave them a significant advantage over enemies who relied on more complex supply chains. The famous Mongol mobility that allowed them to appear suddenly across vast distances was made possible, in part, by their food technology. While European armies needed extensive baggage trains and supply lines, Mongol warriors could sustain themselves on dried meat, fermented dairy products, and whatever they could forage or hunt along the way. As we conclude, it's important to recognize that the Mongol Empire's food culture represents one of humanity's most successful adaptations to extreme environmental conditions. Their innovations in food preservation, their integration of diverse culinary traditions, and their development of nutritionally complete diets from limited resources offer lessons that remain relevant today. In an era of increasing environmental challenges and food security concerns, the Mongol approach to maximizing nutrition from available resources and creating sustainable food systems deserves serious consideration. The legacy of Mongol food culture extends far beyond the steppes of Central Asia. From the dumplings of Eastern Europe to the fermented dairy products of the Caucasus, from the preserved meats of Siberia the spiced teas of Central Asia, the culinary innovations of the Mongols continue to nourish populations across Eurasia. Their story reminds us that food is never just about taste. It's about survival, culture, innovation, and the endless human capacity to adapt and thrive in challenging circumstances. So the next time you encounter an unfamiliar food that seems strange or unappetizing, remember the Mongols and their remarkable culinary journey. What seems disgusting to one culture might be a sophisticated solution to another's challenges. And with that thought, we close our exploration of why food was disgusting in the Mongol Empire, though perhaps we've discovered it wasn't quite as disgusting as we initially thought.